Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to lesson number 4 in our series of lessons about the causes of the American Revolution. This is Unit 1, Lesson 4, Social Studies 8, Trimester 1, and today we're going to continue to answer the essential question, how did conflict between European nations lead to tension in the 13 colonies? Part 2. First of all, there are 2 vocabulary words which will be helpful for you to know in this lesson. The first of those is boycott. When you boycott something, you are refusing to buy something from someone or someplace for political reasons. And repeal is to take back or cancel a law. So if there's a law and it gets canceled or taken away, that's called repealing that law. Both of those words will be helpful for you to know, not only on a test, but to understand this lesson. So remember, we've talked about the French and Indian War, and we've talked about the aftermath of the French and Indian War. And so we're going to pick up where we left off in the last lesson, which is the fact that Britain did win the French and Indian War, but that victory actually led to some problems and some challenges. First of all, the Native Americans who did side with the French chose the wrong side. They lost, and they were very angry and hostile about that. So the British knew that even though they had gained access to those western lands, that they still had a very angry population over there that wasn't exactly going to be thrilled when settlers from the 13 colonies started moving west. And so the British knew they needed to deal with and manage that situation. So the king, being a reasonable guy, said, you know what, we're going to protect the settlers because if they go west, there's going to be some violence. So he created something called the Proclamation Line of 1763. And the whole purpose of that boundary was to make sure that people stayed on the east side of the mountains, completely defeating the point of winning the French-Indian War from the perspective of the colonists. So the Proclamation Line, if you follow my arrow here, literally just went down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains and basically meant the colonists had to stay where they were and they could not move west. Chalk that up as something that didn't make the colonists very happy. They basically thought the war was fought to open up settlement in the West. And so from their perspective, there's like, the war was fought to open up settlement in the West, and now you're telling us we can't move west. So why exactly did we fight this war again? Strike one between the colonists and the King of England. So we're going to focus on the aftermath of the French and Indian War, and there are a lot of cause and effect relationships here. Our left side question is, what was the aftermath of the French-Indian War? We've touched on it a little bit, but we're going to move into it a little bit more. Britain went into debt after the war. War costs money. The British spent a lot of money winning that war, not just in North America, but keep in mind the 7 Years' War was actually a world war that was fought in India, Europe, and the Americas, as well as other places. So the British shelled out a lot of cash to become the world's dominant power. They needed money to help pay for what they spent on the war. Now, before the war, the colonists had it pretty good. They were pretty much affiliated with the British. They were supposed to send raw materials back to the British, but they were allowed to govern themselves, and it was pretty much a hands-off attitude. So that was about to change, and it's kind of like a child who's growing up and all of a sudden their parents start asking more and more of them. It's going to get a little salty. The British passed a series of taxes after the war that angered the colonists, and the whole point of these taxes was to help pay for the French-Indian War. And The problem was that the colonists were not given any say in these taxes, and they were not consulted. They did not have the ability to elect members of the British Parliament. So that's going to make this very interesting. Because they felt they had no say or no representation in the British Parliament, they're basically like, if we have no say in it, we're not paying it. I'm a poet, and I know it. So, on the next slide, we're going to make ourselves a little cause and effect chart, kids. So get ready for that. So, either you're going to create this chart in your notes on paper, or I am going to create it for you in a graphic organizer. In any case, you're going to want to know the years these things happened, the causes, and the effects. First thing we need to know is that the French Indian War took place from 1756 to 1763. It was the 7 Years' War that lasted 9 years. And there were 3 effects of the French Indian War. The first was that the French were completely moved from North America. So the British basically had sovereignty over North America, other than the fact that the Native Americans were already there. But from the point of view of the great power struggle taking place globally across the world, the British were now the preeminent power. The British accumulated a large amount of debt because of the war. And as a result of the war, the colonists in the 13 colonies developed an expectation that they would be able to move west and start colonizing those lands in the Ohio River Valley. So, at the end of the war, basically in 1763, the king and the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act. This would be strike one of the British attempts to extract money from the colonies. This was the first attempt to get the colonists to pay for the French Indian War. And essentially, under the Stamp Act, every official piece of paper was required to have a stamp. So, wills, public documents, I believe even playing cards even had to have stamps on them. And rather than pay this fee or this tax to buy these stamps to put on their official documents, the colonists simply boycotted, notice the vocabulary word, boycotted anything that needed the stamp, prevented the British from making money off the stamp, and so eventually, because the British realized that their attempt to make money off the colonists didn't work, they repealed that law in fairly short order because it was not able to accomplish what the British hoped it was able to accomplish. What it did accomplish was starting to get the colonists riled up that the British were starting to get heavy-handed with them and starting to develop tension between the British parents and the colonist children. So 2 years later, the British passed something called the Quartering Act, which was basically designed to force the colonies to pay for the British soldiers that were in the colonies to quote-unquote protect the colonies. Because quartering soldiers overseas costs money. And they're like, those soldiers are there to protect you. We're going to tax you and make you pay for them. The only problem is the colonial legislatures in the different 13 colonies basically refused to give that money to the British to pay for the soldiers. And so once again, the British try to make money off the colonies, and once again, the colonies basically say, talk to the hand. We're not paying it. What you going to do? And so the British in 1767 responded with the Townsend Acts. And the Townsend Acts were considered to be a more creative way to replace the Stamp Act. And they were a series of taxes on imports from England. So in other words, there were things that the colonists liked to buy from England that were shipped to the colonies as finished products. And the British were kind of like, hey, you like buying our stuff. Anytime you buy our stuff, you have to pay a little extra tax on anything we ship across the ocean to sell to you. And so the colonists once again formed committees. They were known as committees of correspondence, and those committees basically organized boycotts, and they applied a lot of social pressure to people to not buy the British goods and not pay those taxes. I could talk to you in some detail about how much pressure they put on people to not buy those things, but we'll leave it there for now. You need to know these 4 cause and effect relationships here to understand all of this. So, and on the next slide, I'm going to have a couple of videos which are going to show it to you and explain it to you in a little bit more detail. And here are those videos. And as I usually do with these videos, I want you to write down a few new pieces of information that you learn as you watch them. Yeah, it doesn't matter which video it comes from. Just write down a few fun facts, and you'll be in good shape. So I'm going to go ahead and end the video portion of this lesson. And in live and in real time, I'm going to show you these in class and talk you through them. So for now, this is Mr. Blumendahl once again signing off on the Waldo Middle School Social Studies YouTube network.